Judith, look at you. You're pathetic, nothing more than a soaked rat. The 22-year-old intern's shrill laughter sliced through the heavy silence of the corporate lobby. Just seconds ago, she had deliberately emptied a cup of scalding coffee onto my chest. Now she stood there casually fixing her hair with eyes full of disdain. Don't look at me like that. The CEO of this company is my fiancé. I could make you disappear from this industry with a single snap of my fingers. Around me, colleagues I had shared lunch with, people I had personally mentored, unanimously looked away. Their silence was colder than the burns seeping into my skin. The fear of perceived power had turned this luxury lobby into a courtroom without justice, but I didn't tremble and I didn't waste a single word on an argument. I stood tall, feeling the heat of the coffee on my white silk blouse, and slowly pulled out my phone. I pressed a single speed dial button one I hadn't touched in 10 years. "Get down to the lobby now," I said, my voice so calm it caused her smirk to freeze instantly. "Your fiancé is waiting." Don't look away, because this is no ordinary office drama. You are about to witness a breathtaking takedown that this arrogant girl never saw coming. What happens when those elevator doors open will strip away every lie and deliver justice in a way you can't possibly imagine. Stay until the very end, because the twist about who I really am will be the ultimate answer. Never underestimate a woman who chooses silence, because when she finally moves, the rules of the game change forever. My name is Judith, and at 38, I have spent nearly 2 decades navigating the labyrinthine corridors of corporate America as an instructional designer. I am the architect of systems, the woman who designs the frameworks that keep complex organizations running, yet I have always preferred to operate in the shadows of the blueprints rather than under the spotlight of the boardroom. I believed that my work spoke for itself, that excellence was its own shield, until a Tuesday morning in the flagship lobby of Miller & Associates proved that sometimes the systems we build are only as strong as the people who occupy them. The transition from a quiet morning to a theater of cruelty happened in a heartbeat. I was walking across the polished marble, my mind rehearsing the final data points for an audit session that could redefine our company's future. My white silk blouse, a piece I had chosen for its crisp professional authority, caught the morning light. That was when I saw her Brianna, a 22-year-old intern whose only notable achievement was a trail of unearned confidence and a reputation for leveraging whispers into power. She didn't stumble and she didn't lose her footing on the slick floor. Instead, she stepped directly into my path, coming to a dead halt. She looked me straight in the eye with a gaze that was predatory and entirely conscious. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing tilt of her wrist, she emptied her full cup of hot latte. I felt the scalding heat, first a sharp shock against my skin, followed by the heavy, suffocating weight of the liquid soaking through the delicate fabric of my chest. She didn't apologize. She didn't gasp. She simply leaned in close enough for me to smell her expensive perfume and sneered, "Judith, look at you. You're pathetic, nothing more than a soaked rat." Her voice wasn't a whisper. It was a broadcast intended to reach every corner of the vast lobby. "Don't look at me like that. The CEO of this company is my fiancé. I could make you disappear from this industry with a single snap of my fingers." The air in the lobby seemed to vanish. What followed was the corporate freeze, a phenomenon I had studied in textbooks but never felt so acutely in the flesh. This was the anatomy of silence. Around me stood people I had mentored, colleagues I had shared countless coffees with, and security guards I greeted by name every morning. Yet as the latte continued to drip from my hem and puddle on the marble, they didn't move. No one rushed forward with a napkin. No one offered a word of protest. Instead, I watched the collective retreat. People literally stepped backward, creating a wide, empty circle around me, as if Brianna's perceived proximity to power made the very air around me radioactive. They weren't being cruel out of malice, they were being silent out of fear. They saw the stain on my blouse as the mark of a woman who had already been erased. For a woman of my age and experience, the isolation was profound. It was a cold reminder that in the eyes of a youth-obsessed hierarchy, decades of loyalty can be invalidated by a single lie from a mouth that hasn't yet learned the value of a hard day's work. I didn't tremble. I didn't reach down to futilely dab at the brown stain that was now a permanent map of humiliation on my silk blouse. To react emotionally would be to give her the spectacle she craved to validate her role as the victor in this staged execution. Instead, I stood perfectly still, allowing the wet fabric to cling to my skin like a second, colder layer of armor. I spent those seconds not in anger, but in calculation. I looked past Brianna's smug, youthful face and focused on the bystanders. I memorized the faces of the two junior associates who had smirked. I noted the way the HR assistant turned her head to study a digital display as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. I was no longer just a victim of a spill. I was an observer filing away a mental subpoena. I was identifying every crack in the culture I had spent years trying to fortify. Finally, I turned my attention back to the girl standing before me. She was still waiting for me to break, for the tears to well up, or for my voice to crack in a desperate plea. I did neither. I looked at her with a chilling surgical politeness that seemed to unsettle her more than an outburst ever could. I took a slow, deliberate breath and asked, "Could you please state your full name and the department you are currently assigned to?" My voice was neutral, devoid of the heat that was currently burning my skin, sounding more like a court reporter than a woman who had just been assaulted in her own workplace. Brianna let out a sharp, nervous laugh, her eyes flickering toward the audience she had cultivated. "You've got to be kidding me! Didn't you hear what I said? I'm going to be running this place while you're standing in a bread line?" She tossed her empty cup onto the floor at my feet, the plastic thudding against the marble with a hollow, ugly sound. She expected me to cow to realize the reality of her status as the CEO's chosen one. She didn't understand that while she was playing with the illusions of power, I was looking at the mechanics of it. I glanced up at the wall past the grand logo of Miller & Associates to the discreet high-definition security camera perched near the elevator bank. I checked the digital clock beneath it. It was exactly 9:02 a.m. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips, one that didn't reach my eyes. I leaned in, mimicking her earlier intimacy, and whispered to myself just loud enough for the silence to carry it. "Perfect. You chose the one day when the cameras are actually recording the audio." The cold, damp fabric of my blouse felt like a heavy shroud as I walked toward the elevators, the silence of the lobby following me like a ghost. I didn't head for the restroom to scrub away the coffee. I headed straight for the 14th floor. I knew the summons was coming before my phone even vibrated in my pocket. Marcus, the HR director, was someone I had considered a professional ally for over a decade. We had navigated pension transitions and health insurance overhauls together, yet when I stepped into his sprawling, glass-walled office, the warmth I expected was replaced by a clinical, rehearsed air of concern. He didn't look at the brown stain spreading across my chest. He looked at a manila folder on his desk, as if it contained the secrets of the universe. He gestured for me to sit, but I remained standing, my posture as rigid as the corporate values we were about to betray. Marcus sighed a sound that carried the weight of a man who had already traded his conscience for a corner office. He didn't ask if I was burned or if I needed a moment to compose myself. Instead, he slid 2 documents across the polished mahogany surface, a non-disclosure agreement and a severance check with a number of zeros that was clearly intended to buy more than just my silence. He called it a generous gift, a way for me to transition into a new chapter of my life without the messiness of a minor misunderstanding lingering on my record. He spoke in the soft, placating tones one might use for a grieving relative, framing the incident in the lobby as a simple clash of personalities with the CEO's supposed partner. It was the language of erasure. By calling it a misunderstanding, he was systematically stripping away the reality of the assault I had just endured. He was telling me that my 20 years of architectural precision and institutional knowledge were worth exactly the amount printed on that check, provided I walked out the door and never looked back. The betrayal was surgical. Marcus wasn't just a mediator. He was a janitor sent to sweep the inconvenient truth of an entitled girl under a rug woven from legal jargon and hush money. He kept emphasizing that this was for my own good, a way to protect my reputation from the unfortunate optics of a public feud with a woman of Brianna's perceived status. While Marcus continued his practiced monologue, I looked through the transparent walls of the HR suite down into the open-plan office where my team sat. My heart constricted at the sight. Brianna was there, but she wasn't at her intern station. She was sitting in my ergonomic chair, her feet clad in designer heels that cost more than her monthly stipend, propped up on my desk. She was holding court, gesturing wildly as she gave instructions to my senior subordinates, men and women in their 50s, who had more experience in their little fingers than she had in her entire body. They were nodding their faces tight with a mixture of confusion and survival-driven compliance. She was literally usurping my space, my authority, and my life's work in real time. The visual of that false empire was a visceral sting. It showed me how fragile the meritocracy we preached actually was. In this building, decades of blood, sweat, and intellectual labor could be bypassed by a girl who simply whispered the right name in the right ear. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as it was designed to protect the protected and discard the workers. I turned my gaze back to the documents on the desk, my analytical mind kicking into gear. I had spent my career spotting flaws in complex systems, and as I scanned the NDA, the architect in me took over. I noticed the date immediately. It was backdated by 48 hours, an amateurish attempt to make it look as though this separation had been planned long before the coffee hit my shirt. Then I saw the language. It was sloppily drafted, filled with vague clauses that wouldn't hold up in a serious court, but were designed to intimidate a layman. As I read between the lines, the true picture emerged. HR wasn't just protecting a fiancé, they were terrified. I realized that Marcus and his team had been using discretionary company funds to settle at least 3 other incidents involving Brianna over the last 6 months. They hadn't reported them because they were complicit in the cover-up, and they knew that I was the only person in the building with the access and the expertise to track those hidden ledgers. This wasn't about a spilled latte. It was about a frantic effort to bury a paper trail of embezzlement and gross misconduct before the annual audit began. Marcus was still talking, his voice a drone of false empathy, telling me how much he valued our history and how he didn't want to see my career tarnished by an emotional reaction. He actually had the audacity to suggest that my refusal to sign would be seen as a sign of mental instability brought on by mid-career burnout. I looked at him, and for the first time in an hour, I felt a surge of genuine power. He thought he was managing a victim, but he was actually sitting across from a witness who had already seen the exit signs. He thought the check was a lifeline, but it was actually a confession. I reached out, my fingers steady as they touched the edge of the backdated document. I didn't pick up the pen. I didn't look at the check. I looked Marcus directly in the eyes, seeing the flicker of sweat on his brow that belied his calm demeanor. He knew the stakes, but he had underestimated my speed. I pushed the NDA back across the table, the paper sliding effortlessly over the mahogany. I leaned forward, my voice a whisper of pure, cold clarity that silenced his desperate rambling. I'm not signing this because I already sent my resignation to the board of directors 10 minutes ago. The color drained from Marcus's face so rapidly, it was as if I had pulled a literal plug on his life support. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, while the silence in the glass office became heavy with the scent of his sudden frantic panic. He looked down at the unsigned NDA and the check as if they were venomous snakes. He didn't understand that by quitting I hadn't surrendered. I had liberated myself. In the eyes of Miller and Associates, I was no longer an employee subject to the restrictive bylaws of the Internal Handbook, a document carefully designed to muzzle dissent under the guise of corporate loyalty. As a private citizen, the non-disparagement clauses and the internal gag orders that Marcus relied on to protect his secrets were now worthless scraps of paper. I leaned back, watching him realize that I was no longer a problem to be managed, but a primary witness to a crime he was currently trying to hide. I told him with a voice as cold as the marble in the lobby that I had triggered a multi-million-dollar compliance audit through an external regulatory body 2 hours before I even stepped foot in the building. He wasn't just facing a disgruntled worker. He was facing a whistleblower who was now legally protected by federal law beyond the reach of his backdated threats and severance bribes. To Marcus, I was just an instructional designer. A woman who made sure the staff knew how to use the latest software or follow standard operating procedures. He had no idea that I was the ghost architect of the company's entire compliance infrastructure. Years ago, the founder had tasked me with building the safety nets that would catch ethical lapses before they became lawsuits. I hadn't just written the manuals, I had coded the logic. I knew exactly where the red folders were hidden in the digital cloud, the encrypted logs that tracked every administrative settlement paid out to quiet victims of workplace harassment. More importantly, I knew that the intern downstairs wasn't the CEO's fiancé. My research into the company's shadow ledger had revealed a far more dangerous truth. Brianna was the niece of a secret junior board member who had been quietly funneling company resources to fund his own private ventures. HR had been her protector not out of respect for the CEO, but out of a desperate, terrified loyalty to a man who held their careers in his hands. I knew the names, the dates, and the exact dollar amounts. I had built the cage, and now I was the only one with the key to let the truth out. Instead of rushing to the elevators to hide my shame, I did something Marcus never expected. I went back to the lobby. I walked through the corporate freeze once again, but this time the air felt different. I found the most prominent chair in the center of the vast glass-walled space, a position where every visitor, every partner, and every passing executive would be forced to see me. I sat down, my spine perfectly straight, despite the brown latte stain that had now dried into a stiff, ugly crust across my chest. When the floor manager approached me with a worried expression asking if I wanted to go to the lounge to clean up, I declined with a sharp, public smile. I told him I wasn't leaving until my personal belongings were returned and my final exit interview was conducted in public view. I became a living, breathing, ticking time bomb. Every second I sat there, a woman of my stature and tenure, visibly humiliated and ignored, the company's carefully curated professional image was hemorrhaging. I watched as high-profile clients entered the lobby, their eyes darting from the Grand Miller logo to the woman with the ruined blouse. They whispered, they questioned, and I sat in total radiant silence, letting the visual of their failure speak louder than any protest. The intern, emboldened by my apparent departure, couldn't resist one final victory lap. She walked across the marble, her heels clicking with a rhythmic arrogance that echoed off the high ceilings. She stopped in front of me, looking down with a mix of pity and triumph. She thought she had won. She thought that by forcing me out, she had cleared the path for her uncle's coup and her own unearned ascension. She leaned over, her voice a low hiss, intended only for me, mocking my stubbornness and telling me that no one would ever believe a bitter middle-aged failure over a woman with her connections. She laughed, a sound so hollow it made the surrounding silence feel even deeper. She began to say something about how the CEO would personally see to it that I was blacklisted from every firm in the city, her smirk widening as she waited for me to finally break. But her words died in her throat as the heavy, revolving doors at the entrance began to spin with a sudden, violent urgency. A sleek black SUV had pulled up to the curb, its tinted windows gleaming under the afternoon sun. The lobby fell into a different kind of silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of true authority. 4 men in dark charcoal suits stepped out of the vehicle, their movements synchronized and professional. They didn't look at the grand reception desk. They didn't look at the junior associates who scrambled to open the doors. They ignored the intern, entirely pushing past her as if she were a piece of discarded furniture. They walked with a singular, focused purpose, their eyes locked on me. The intern's hand went to her throat, her face pale as she realized these weren't Miller employees. They were the external auditors I had called, accompanied by the general counsel's private investigators. They reached my chair, and for the first time in hours, someone offered me a hand. The intern walks over to mock her one last time, but stops cold when a black SUV pulls up and 4 men in suits step out, ignoring the intern and walking straight to Carmen. The arrival of the 4 men in charcoal suits acted as a silent signal, a ripple that traveled through the lobby and surged up the elevator banks. Within minutes, the heavy oak doors of the executive suite opened, and Arthur Miller, the CEO, stepped out. He didn't look like a man coming to save a damsel. He looked like a man coming to extinguish a fire that had threatened his house. He was flanked by the general counsel, a woman whose reputation for legal ruthlessness was legendary. The atmosphere in the lobby shifted from curiosity to a sharp electric tension. This was the moment of the great denial. The point where the illusions of a 22-year-old girl would collide with the cold, hard reality of the empire she had tried to manipulate. Brianna, seeing Arthur, instantly transformed. The sneer vanished, replaced by a mask of trembling vulnerability. She let out a small theatrical sob and ran toward him, her hands reaching out to clutch his arm. It was a practiced move, the performance of a distressed fiancé seeking protection from her hero. The audience in the lobby held their collective breath, waiting for the CEO to wrap an arm around her and demand an apology from me. Instead, Arthur Miller stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down at Brianna's hand on his sleeve with an expression of genuine clinical confusion, as if a strange insect had landed on his suit. He didn't pull away with anger. He pulled away with a chilling lack of recognition. He turned his head slightly toward the general counsel and asked in a voice that carried to the furthest corners of the marble hall, "Is this the temporary filing clerk who was flagged for the background check failure? Why is she still on the premises and why is she touching me?" The silence that followed was deafening. It was a physical weight pressing down on the bystanders who had spent the last 2 hours bowing to a girl who it turns out was nothing more than a ghost in the system. Brianna's face didn't just turn pale. It turned a ghostly, translucent gray. Her mouth worked, but no sound came out, her entire empire of lies evaporating under the surgical precision of Arthur's gaze. Then Arthur turned to me. He ignored the gasps and the frantic whispering of the junior associates. He walked past Brianna as if she were a piece of discarded office equipment and stood before my chair. He looked at the brown, crusty stain on my vintage silk blouse, a piece of fabric that represented 20 years of my dignity, and he did something no one expected. He bowed his head slightly. He didn't apologize for the coffee. He knew that was a petty act of a petty girl. Instead, he apologized for the breach of professional protocol that had allowed an unauthorized person to claim a personal connection to the executive office. He spoke of the failure of the culture, the breakdown of the very systems I had built, and the institutional cowardice that had allowed this theater of cruelty to persist for even a minute. The bystanders who had backed the wrong horse, who had stepped away from the blast radius of my humiliation, now looked like they wanted the marble floor to swallow them whole. They realized that by aligning with the intern's false power, they had betrayed the real power standing right in front of them. The unraveling moved quickly from the social to the systemic. Marcus, the HR director, had scurried down from the 14th floor, his face a mask of sweating desperation. He tried to interject to offer a contextual explanation, but the general counsel stepped forward, her voice a sharp contrast to his stuttering. She didn't ask for his opinion, she demanded the manila folder he was clutching. In front of everyone, she revealed the backdated non-disclosure agreement and the unauthorized severance check. She didn't just expose the document, she exposed the crime. She turned to the gathered crowd and the auditors from the black SUV, explaining that the intern wasn't a fiancé, nor was she a victim of a misunderstanding. She was the niece of a junior board member, a man who had been using the HR department as a private laundry service to launder unqualified family members into high-paying, sensitive roles. Marcus hadn't been protecting a romance. He had been protecting a conspiracy. He had been shielding Brianna's previous incidents of harassment and theft to keep his own complicity hidden from the board. The intern was no longer a predator. She was a cornered animal. She looked around the lobby searching for a single friendly face, but the people who had smirked at me only minutes ago were now staring at their shoes. The corporate freeze had reversed its direction, and she was the one caught in the ice. The general counsel began listing the specific compliance violations, each one a nail in the coffin of the junior board member's attempted coup. They had underestimated the ghost architect. They had assumed that because I was a woman of a certain age, a woman who valued silence and precision, I wouldn't have the stomach for a public execution. They were wrong. I sat there still in my stained blouse and watched as the reality of their professional death sentences was read aloud in the very lobby they thought they owned. The intern's designer heels, which had clicked so triumphantly earlier, now seemed to buckle under her. Arthur Miller looked at Brianna one last time, his expression one of pure professional dismissal. He didn't need to raise his voice. The truth was loud enough. He turned to the security team that had finally materialized, no longer confused about whose side they were on. The power had shifted back to its rightful place, and the theater of cruelty was officially closed. The CEO turns to the intern and says, "Security will escort you out. And don't worry about the coffee. You'll be receiving the bill for Carmen's vintage silk blouse via our legal team." The intern's departure was not the end of the day's business. It was merely the clearing of the stage for the true performance to begin. As the security team led the sobbing girl away, the lobby's atmosphere transformed from a theater of cruelty into a high-stakes war room. Arthur Miller didn't return to his office. Instead, he gestured toward the secure boardroom elevators, his eyes meeting mine with a look of profound mutual understanding. The audience of onlookers watched in stunned silence, still struggling to reconcile the soaked rat they had ignored with the woman now walking side by side with the CEO. They didn't know that my resignation was never an act of surrender. It was a prearranged signal, a flare sent into the night for the majority shareholders who had been watching Miller and Associates from the shadows for months. I wasn't just an instructional designer who had been caught in a messy spat. I was a secret stakeholder's most trusted asset. We had known for a long time that a junior board member, a man named Henderson, was orchestrating a quiet coup. He had been installing loyalists like his niece into sensitive positions to bypass our internal controls. I had been their undercover agent tasked with staying in the trenches until the corruption became so arrogant that it exposed itself in a way that could not be ignored by the law or the public. Inside the boardroom, the air was cold and smelled of expensive leather and impending judgment. Henderson was already there, his face a mask of feigned outrage as he prepared to defend his niece and his family's honor. He didn't realize that the ghost architect had already dismantled his defenses. I didn't say a word as I reached into the pocket of my stained blazer and pulled out a small silver thumb drive. I placed it on the center of the mahogany table like a polished bullet. This was the paper trail Henderson thought he had deleted. On that drive was every ignored complaint from the past 3 years, every instance where HR had been forced to bury Henderson's misconduct or his niece's previous legal liabilities using company funds. The coffee spill in the lobby wasn't just a rude act of a spoiled girl. It was the final critical data point I needed to prove a systemic, hostile work environment under Henderson's direct influence. Because the incident had happened in a public lobby with witnesses, and because I had resigned to remove the company's internal shield, Arthur Miller now had the legal leverage to fire Henderson for cause. It was a surgical strike that stripped him of his board seat, his shares, and his multi-million-dollar exit package without a single cent of payout. Henderson looked at the drive, then at me, the realization of his total defeat finally sinking in. He tried to bluster to claim that I was still just a mid-level employee who didn't understand how real business worked. But Arthur Miller silenced him with a flick of his wrist. Arthur then turned to me, offering me my old position back with a significant raise and a title that would make me the most powerful woman in the department. But I didn't want my old life back. I had seen too much of how the meritocracy could be manipulated when the guardians of the gate decided to look the other way. I declined the offer, watching the confusion bloom on the faces of the remaining board members. I didn't want my desk, and I didn't want a bigger paycheck for doing the same job. Instead, I demanded structural revenge. I dictated the terms for a new independent ethics oversight role, a position that would report only to the chair of the board and the majority shareholders, completely bypassing the CEO and the HR department. I wanted the power to ensure that no other woman, regardless of her age or tenure, would ever have to stand in that lobby with a stained shirt and no allies. I wanted to be the person who held the magnifying glass over every hiring decision and every settlement. The room went silent as they realized I wasn't asking for permission. I was stating the price of my continued silence regarding the shareholders' involvement. My victory wasn't just about getting an intern fired. It was about purging the very floor we were standing on. Henderson was no longer a board member. He was a liability being excised from the corporate body. As the meeting concluded and the official legal papers were signed, 2 plainclothes officers who had been waiting in the hall stepped forward. Henderson's bravado finally collapsed into a pathetic, stuttering mess as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, not for the coffee, but for the embezzlement I had uncovered while tracking his niece's unearned salary. As the junior board member is escorted out of the building in handcuffs, he asks how she knew he'd fall for it. Carmen replies, "I didn't need you to fall. I just needed you to be yourself." The echoes of Henderson's footsteps and the metallic click of handcuffs eventually faded into the sterile silence of the executive hallway, leaving behind a company that was fundamentally changed. In the weeks that followed, the cold reality of professional consequence descended upon those who had mistaken unearned privilege for permanent power. There was no grand shouting match, no dramatic office brawl. There was only the quiet, systematic removal of the rot. Brianna, the girl who had believed she was untouchable because of a whispered name, found herself utterly blacklisted from the industry. Her name became synonymous with liability rather than luxury. I occasionally heard reports of her. She was seen working a menial service job at a local cafe, the irony of which was lost on no one. Without her uncle's shadow to protect her, her attitude was no longer a weapon of dominance. It was merely a character flaw that cost her job after job. Marcus, the HR director who had traded his integrity for a seat at the table, didn't receive a golden parachute or a farewell party. I watched from my office window as he left the building for the final time, carrying his life's work in a single cardboard box. His reputation in ruins, he disappeared into the anonymity of the city, a man whose legacy was nothing more than a cautionary tale about the high cost of complicity. 6 months have passed since that morning in the lobby, and the Miller and Associates I walk through today is a reflection of a new horizon. I am no longer tucked away in the shadows of the instructional design department. I now lead the board sessions sitting at the head of the long mahogany table as the guardian of the culture. My role is independent, vital, and respected. Today, I am wearing a new white blouse even more elegant than the vintage silk one that was ruined a gift to myself to commemorate the day I stood my ground. As I look around the room, I don't see a corporate freeze or faces clouded by fear. Instead, the room is filled with a new generation of professionals, men and women, who look at me with genuine respect, not because of whom I am engaged to, but because of the standard I set. We have built reporting channels that actually work and accountability safeguards that no junior board member can bypass. I have ensured that the meritocracy we speak of is a living reality, not just a marketing slogan. I have moved from being the woman who designed the systems to the woman who protects the people within them. Reflecting on that Tuesday morning, I realized that the incident in the lobby was the most important lesson I ever taught, though it wasn't in any manual. For 20 years, I believed that my silence was a sign of my professional restraint, but I now know that my silence was actually a gathering of evidence. It was the radiant calm that allowed the storm to break exactly where I needed it to. When I look at the younger versions of myself now, the women who are just starting their journeys, who feel the heat of unearned arrogance pressing against them, I want them to understand that the loudest person in the room is almost always the most fragile. Entitlement is a house of cards that requires the silence of others to remain standing. The moment you refuse to play your assigned role as the victim, the entire structure begins to wobble. Dignity isn't about shouting to be heard. It's about having a truth so solid that it doesn't need to be shouted. It is about the patience to wait for the moment when the system's own weight causes it to collapse. The stain on my old blouse is gone, replaced by a clarity of purpose I never thought possible. I have learned that true power doesn't come from a title or a connection. It comes from the ability to stay present and analytical when everyone else is looking away. I am no longer just an architect of instructional content. I am the architect of a new kind of corporate justice. My victory was structural, not just personal. It was about creating a world where the quiet ones, the workers, and the loyalists are the ones who finally get to write the ending. The company is thriving now, not because of secret boardroom deals, but because the people in the lobby finally feel safe enough to look each other in the eye. I sit in my office as the sun sets over the city. A woman who proved that you don't need a loud voice to change the world, you just need the right evidence and the courage to wait for the tide to turn. They thought they were drowning me in coffee. They didn't realize I was the one who controlled the tide. I truly hope this story serves as a powerful reminder that your worth is never defined by someone else's arrogance, and that true justice always finds its way to those who stand their ground with dignity. If Judith's journey from a humiliated employee to a guardian of truth inspired you today, please consider subscribing to our channel and hitting the notification bell so you never miss a story of resilience and empowerment. We create these narratives for you, and your support helps us continue bringing these lessons of courage to life. Now, I want to hear from you because your perspective is the heart of this community. How would you have reacted if you were in Judith's shoes that morning in the lobby? Have you ever had to face a toxic person who thought they were untouchable because of their connections? Share your thoughts and personal experiences in the comments below. We read every single one of them, and your insights often spark the most incredible discussions among our viewers. Let's support one another in building a world where character always triumphs over entitlement. Thank you for watching, for sharing your voice, and for being an essential part of our journey toward justice and integrity.